A young prince stood beneath the burning African sun, believing his future would be filled with honor, power, and peace. He had warriors who respected him, a father who trusted him, and a kingdom waiting for his leadership. But one terrible day changed everything. A sudden attack turned his life into a nightmare. He was dragged across oceans in chains, stripped of his name, and forced into slavery in a strange land where nobody cared that he was born royal. For 40 long years, he carried a secret that shocked the world when it was finally revealed. Before we begin this emotional and unforgettable story, please subscribe, like, and share this video. Your support helps us continue bringing forgotten histories to life. And when the story ends, do not forget to leave a comment telling us what you learned from this incredible journey. The Prince of Futajalan begins in a land where the air was warm and the soil rich, and the mountains of Futajalan stood tall like silent guardians over peaceful villages, where life moved with rhythm and meaning, where Abdul Rahman Ibrahim Ibn Sori was born into royalty and raised under the guidance of a powerful father who ruled with wisdom and strength. He was not an ordinary child. From early age, he was taught discipline, leadership, courage, and respect. He learned to ride horses across wide lands. He learned how to listen before speaking. He learned how to judge matters with fairness. And he grew under the belief that one day he would lead his people with honor. His father was a respected ruler who believed that power without mercy was destruction. So he trained his son not only in warfare but in wisdom. Abdullah Rahman often sat with elders during long evenings where fires burned softly, and stories of politics, land disputes, and distant threats were shared. He listened carefully as decisions that shaped the kingdom were discussed, and slowly he began to understand that leadership was not about pride, but about sacrifice and responsibility. The people of Futajalan respected him deeply because even in his youth he carried himself with calm dignity. He did not speak too much, but when he spoke, people listened. Warriors admired his bravery during training sessions, where he fought under the hot sun until his arms grew tired and his clothes soaked with sweat. Yet he never complained. He believed strength was duty, not privilege. But beyond the palace walls, there was another reality, growing in silence. Danger surrounded the region as rival groups fought for control of land and trade routes, and human lives were becoming currency in the hands of slave traders who moved quietly through forests and villages, capturing the weak and the unsuspecting. Abdullah Rahman heard whispers of villages destroyed, families broken apart, and people taken far away across lands they would never return from. It troubled him deeply because he could not understand how humans could treat others with such cruelty. His father warned him that greed was a disease that destroyed even the strongest kingdoms. One morning, a messenger arrived, breathless with news of a nearby settlement attacked. People had vanished without trace. Fear spread through the palace like fire in dry grass. Warriors prepared for search and protection, and Abdul Rahman felt a heavy responsibility rise in his heart. He volunteered to lead a patrol despite his father's hesitation, believing that a true leader must face danger alongside his people. At dawn, he rode out with trusted men across forests and open land, searching for clues of the attackers. Days passed as they discovered broken camps and signs of struggle. Tension grew with every step until they entered a narrow forest path where silence felt unnatural. Birds stopped singing, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Suddenly armed men appeared from all sides like shadows rising from earth. Arrows flew through the air, and chaos erupted instantly. Horses panicked, men shouted, and Abdul Rahman drew his sword, fighting with fierce determination, striking down attackers and protecting his companions with everything he had. But the enemy was too many and too prepared. One by one, his men fell despite their bravery. Abdul Rahman fought until exhaustion slowed his movements. A heavy blow struck him and the world turned dark as he collapsed into unconsciousness. When he awoke, everything had changed. His hands were tied, his legs chained, and strangers surrounded him, speaking harsh words he could not fully understand. Fear settled in his chest as he realized he was no longer free. Days turned into endless marching under brutal conditions as captives were forced through forests and rough terrain. Anyone who fell behind was punished. Suffering surrounded him on every side. Yet Abdullah Rahman tried to hold on to his identity, refusing to let despair erase who he was. At night, under cold skies, he looked at stars and remembered his home, his father, and the life he once knew. Hope still existed, but it weakened with each passing day. The group eventually reached the coast where Abdul Rahman saw massive ships for the first time, towering like floating prisons waiting to swallow human lives. The sound of waves, mixed with cries of captives, created a haunting scene that would never leave his memory. Families were separated, people were inspected like objects, and value was assigned to human bodies as if they were nothing more than tools. Abdul Rahman resisted and was beaten until he could no longer stand, then dragged onto a ship where darkness and suffocation greeted him. Below deck, inside the ship, hundreds of enslaved people were packed tightly. Air was thick. Chains clanged constantly, and cries filled the night as the ocean carried them toward an unknown destiny. Disease spread, hope faded, and survival became uncertain. Yet even in that darkness, something inside Abdullah Rahman refused to break completely. He remembered his father's teachings that a true leader must endure even in suffering, and he silently promised himself that no matter what happened, he would not lose his identity completely. The ocean carried them for weeks through storms and hunger until land finally appeared, a new world waiting ahead. But Abdullah Rahman did not know that his life was about to enter a chapter filled with unimaginable hardship in a place called Mississippi, where cotton fields and chains would test the limits of human endurance, and where a prince would be forced to live as a slave for decades without the world knowing who he truly was. The secret that shook the world begins in a time when whispers traveled faster than truth, and truth itself struggled to survive against fear, disbelief, and profit. And at the center of it all stood Abdul Rahman Ibrahim Ibn Sori, a man whose life had already crossed oceans of suffering, and who now found himself standing at the edge of a revelation that could change everything he had known since the day he was captured. The plantation, that once felt like a silent prison, had now become a place of unusual attention because strangers began to arrive more frequently. Some were curious visitors, some were men of religion, some were writers holding paper and ink, and some were powerful individuals who came not to help but to observe. And each of them looked at Abdullah Rahman differently, as if trying to solve a mystery hidden inside a human life. He felt their eyes on him constantly, and though he had learned to endure pain over many years, this kind of attention carried a different weight, because it threatened the only thing slavery had not fully taken from him, which was invisibility, the quiet ability to survive without being examined like a strange object. But now everything was changing as rumors spread beyond the plantation fields into towns and cities far away. People were speaking about an African man who wrote in a language they could not understand, and who spoke with dignity unlike what they expected from someone in chains. The story reached newspapers, and from there it grew larger than anyone expected. Some people believed it immediately, while others rejected it as impossible, because in their minds, enslaved people were not supposed to have royal histories, education, or leadership backgrounds. But curiosity is a powerful force, and soon even those who doubted began to pay attention. Abdullah Rahman watched all of this quietly while continuing his labor because his daily life had not changed, even though the world around him was beginning to shift. He still woke before sunrise, still walked into the field, still felt the burn of cotton plants against his skin and the exhaustion that never left his body. But now he carried something new inside him. Uncertainty about what truth would do to his life if it was fully revealed. One afternoon, a group of visitors arrived and requested to see him directly. Among them was a man who had once traveled in Africa and who recognized something unusual in Abdul Rahman's speech and manner. This man, John Cox, spent time speaking with him privately, and as their conversation deepened, something extraordinary began to unfold. Abdul Rahman spoke about his homeland in a way that only someone who had lived within its leadership circles could describe. He mentioned traditions, governance, family lineage, and cultural practices that could not easily be imitated. And he wrote words in Arabic with natural fluency that shocked those watching. The room fell silent as people realized they were not witnessing an ordinary enslaved worker, but someone who carried education and identity far beyond what they had imagined. This was the moment when the hidden truth began to surface, and the identity of Abdul Rahman Ibrahim ibn Sori started to move from rumor into recognition. Yet even with this discovery, there was resistance because truth alone does not change systems built on profit. The plantation owner, Thomas Foster, reacted with suspicion and anger. He feared losing valuable labor and also feared the attention that was now surrounding his property. He began restricting access to Abdul Rahman and limited conversations with outsiders. But it was already too late because the story had escaped into the wider world. Newspapers published reports describing an enslaved African man who might be of royal origin. Some articles exaggerated details while others tried to dismiss it entirely. But none of them could ignore the growing attention. In towns and cities, people debated the idea passionately. Some said it was proof that Africans had complex societies and leadership systems. Others refused to believe it, because accepting it would challenge their entire justification for slavery. This tension created an atmosphere of conflict far beyond the plantation itself. And Abdul Rahman found himself at the center of arguments he never asked to be part of. He remained calm outwardly, but inside he felt a deep struggle because the revelation of his identity did not bring immediate freedom. Instead, it brought scrutiny. He was no longer just a man surviving slavery. He was now a symbol in a battle of ideas. Some visitors treated him with unusual respect, while others treated him with suspicion, as if intelligence in an enslaved person was something dangerous. During one visit, he was asked to write Arabic phrases in front of witnesses, and when he did so with precision, the reaction was immediate. Some people gasped, others stepped back, and a few began to question everything they believed about race and ability. Yet still others insisted it could be learned trickery. Abdul Rahman listened to all of this without anger, because he understood something deeper, that people often reject truths that threaten their comfort. In quiet moments, he spoke with Cox again, who told him that discussions about his origin were spreading into influential circles and that there might be efforts to secure his freedom. But freedom in words and freedom in reality were very different things. Thomas Foster refused every suggestion because he saw Abdul Rahman as property that had generated years of profit, and letting him go would mean financial loss. This resistance created tension that grew stronger each week. Meanwhile, enslaved people on the plantation watched everything carefully because they understood that when attention falls on one person, it can sometimes bring danger or hope to many. Some whispered that change might come. Others feared punishment if anything disrupted the plantation order. Abdul Rahman himself became more reflective during this time. He thought deeply about identity and what it meant to be recognized after years of being denied humanity. He wondered why only now the world cared about his story when so many others suffered silently without recognition. This question stayed in his mind constantly. One night while speaking with Isabella, he shared his confusion, and she reminded him that truth often appears slowly in a world built on silence. Their bond during this period became even stronger because both understood uncertainty and fear in different ways. Isabella had lived her own trauma of separation and loss, and she saw in Abdul Rahman not a symbol, but a man carrying invisible wounds as attention continued to grow. More visitors arrived asking questions. Some wanted confirmation of his education. Others wanted to hear his memories of Africa, and some simply wanted to witness what they believed was an unusual story. Abdul Rahman responded with honesty but carefully guarded emotion, because he knew that every word could be used either to free him or to trap him further. In distant places, intellectual discussions began about his case. Some scholars argued that if his story was true, it proved African civilizations had structured leadership and education systems. Others resisted, because it threatened ideas that justified slavery. These debates created pressure that slowly moved toward action. But change was slow and uncertain. Abdul Rahman waited while continuing his daily survival. Each passing blending into the next. Yet something inside him began to shift, because for the first time in decades he felt that the world might finally see him as more than labor. Still, fear remained because recognition did not guarantee safety. Thomas Foster grew increasingly defensive and sometimes refused visitors altogether. He feared legal consequences and public criticism, yet he also feared losing control over someone he had relied on for years. This internal conflict made him unpredictable, and the plantation atmosphere became tense. During this time, Abdullah Rahman was asked repeatedly to recount of his life before capture, and each time he spoke of Africa, memories returned with both warmth and pain. He described mountains, rivers, teachings, and the structure of leadership in his homeland. And those listening struggled to reconcile these descriptions with their assumptions. Some were moved deeply, while others remained skeptical. One visiting group even attempted to verify his language and education by presenting Arabic texts, which he read effortlessly. This moment created further shock and strengthened belief among some observers that he truly was who he claimed to be. But even as evidence increased, resistance remained strong because social systems do not collapse easily. Abdul Rahman felt trapped between two worlds. In one, he was a prince, remembered only in fragments, and in the other, he was a slave whose identity was under debate. This tension created emotional exhaustion that he carried silently. He often stood alone at night, thinking about what freedom would actually mean for him after so many years had passed. Would he return to Africa? Would his family be freed with him? Would he even be accepted there after such a long absence? These questions had no clear answers, yet hope slowly began to form despite uncertainty. As months passed, the pressure surrounding his case increased further, and discussions about legal freedom became more serious. Abolitionist groups and sympathetic observers began organizing efforts to secure his release. They argued that his case represented a moral contradiction that could not be ignored, yet opposition from economic interests remained strong. The plantation owner continued resisting every request. creating a long struggle between morality and profit. Through it all, Abdul-Rahman remained patient. Though deeply weary, he understood that his life had become something larger than himself. It had become a test of whether truth could survive in a world built on denial. And as this chapter of his journey moved forward, he did not yet know that the attention growing around him would eventually transform not only his life, but also how many people began to view Africa, identity, and humanity itself. And that realization would come with both freedom and new forms of loss that he could not yet imagine. Freedom with invisible chains begins at a moment when hope had finally started to rise in the life of Abdul-Rahman Ibrahim Ibn Sori. But hope in a world built on slavery was never simple, never clean, and never without pain. Because even as his name began to travel farther beyond Mississippi, the reality of his daily existence remained unchanged. He still woke before sunrise. He still walked into fields of cotton that stretched endlessly under the burning sun. And he still felt the weight of exhaustion pressing into his bones, as if time itself had decided to remain his enemy. Yet something was different now. People were watching him, speaking about him, questioning him. And for the first time in decades, his existence was no longer invisible. Strangers arrived more frequently. Some carried notebooks, some carried religious texts, and some carried curiosity that bordered on disbelief. They came to see the man who was rumored to be more than a slave, a man who was said to have once been a prince in Africa, and each encounter added another layer to the growing tension around him. But Abdul-Rahman remained careful, because attention in his world was dangerous. Attention could bring change, but it could also bring punishment. And he had learned through years of suffering that survival required silence as much as truth. Inside the plantation, Thomas Foster watched everything closely. He had begun to feel pressure from outside voices, people asking questions about the enslaved African man who could read and write in Arabic, who spoke with dignity, and who seemed to carry a history that did not fit into the structure of slavery. Foster did not like this attention because it threatened his control, and more importantly, it threatened his profit. Abdul-Rahman was not just labor to him anymore. He was now a problem that could grow beyond his control. So restrictions increased. Visitors were limited. Conversations were monitored. And Abdul-Rahman was kept under closer watch than before. Yet even with these controls, the story could no longer be contained. Newspapers in distant towns continued to publish fragments of his story, sometimes accurate, sometimes exaggerated, but always powerful enough to draw attention. People debated fiercely. Some said it was impossible for an enslaved African to be of royal blood. Others argued that if it were true, then slavery was built on lies, and that idea terrified many who depended on slavery for their livelihood. Abdul-Rahman found himself trapped in the center of this storm, not by choice, but by truth that refused to stay buried. One of the most important turning points came when a visiting doctor named John Cox returned to the plantation and spent time speaking with him again. Cox listened carefully as Abdul-Rahman described details of his homeland, its leadership systems, its traditions, and the structure of his royal family. And the more he listened, the more certain he became that this was not imitation or fantasy. It was memory, real memory of a man who had lived a life far beyond the fields of Mississippi. Cox had once traveled in West Africa and recognized certain cultural and linguistic patterns that Abdul-Rahman described, and slowly pieces of a forgotten identity began to align. The conclusion was shocking but undeniable. This enslaved man was connected to a royal lineage that had once held authority and respect in his homeland. And that truth carried consequences far beyond personal recognition. It challenged everything people believed about race, ability, and human worth. As his realization spread, Abdul Rahman began to experience something new, not freedom, but recognition. And recognition in a world like his was both powerful and dangerous. Visitors began treating him differently, some with respect, some with curiosity, and others with suspicion. Because acknowledging his intelligence meant confronting uncomfortable truths about slavery itself, Abdul Rahman was sometimes asked to demonstrate his literacy in Arabic. And when he did so effortlessly, the reactions were immediate and intense. Silence would fall, followed by shock, and then debate would begin again about whether such ability could exist in someone enslaved. Yet even as proof accumulated, resistance remained strong, because truth alone does not dismantle systems built on economic dependence. Thomas Foster continued to refuse any suggestion of release. He viewed Abdul Rahman as valuable property and could not accept losing him, especially now that attention had increased his perceived importance. This created a painful contradiction. The more his identity was confirmed, the more valuable he became. As property rather than less, Abdul Rahman himself struggled deeply with this reality because recognition was supposed to lead to freedom, but instead it often led to deeper control. During this period, he spoke often with Isabella, who remained his emotional anchor in a world of uncertainty. She understood fear and separation in ways that words could barely describe, and their conversations became a space where he could express doubts he never shared with others. One evening he admitted that he did not understand why the world only cared about his identity now, after so many years of suffering. Isabella told him that truth in such a world does not arrive quickly. It arrives when people are forced to see what they have chosen to ignore. Her words did not remove his pain, but they gave it meaning. Outside the plantation, the debate about his identity continued to grow. Abolitionist voices began using his story as evidence against slavery, arguing that if a man of royal African lineage could be enslaved for decades, then slavery was not only cruel but fundamentally unjust. Supporters of slavery pushed back strongly, insisting that his story was either exaggerated or irrelevant. But the tension was building, and Abdul Rahman found himself becoming a symbol in arguments that stretched far beyond his control. Inside him, this created emotional conflict because he was still a man living through trauma, yet the world now saw him as a case study, a proof, or a controversy, not simply a human being. Even so, moments of quiet reflection remained. And in those moments, he often thought of Africa, of the life he once had, and of the family he might never see again. The uncertainty of his origins and the distance of 40 years weighed heavily on him. Because even if freedom came, time could not be returned, memories could not be restored, and relationships could not simply continue as if nothing had changed. As pressure increased, discussions about his freedom became more serious among influential people. Some argued that releasing him would demonstrate moral progress, while others resisted because it would set a precedent that threatened the entire system. Abdul Rahman remained in the center of the struggle without having any control over its direction. Each day he continued working, each night he continued hoping, and each moment he carried the invisible burden of being both evidence and prisoner at the same time. During one public encounter, he was asked to speak about his life in Africa, and he described it with calm clarity, speaking of culture, leadership, and education. And those listening struggled to reconcile his words with their assumptions about enslaved Africans. Some were moved deeply, others remained skeptical. But no one could ignore him. His presence demanded attention, and his story refused to be dismissed. As time moved forward, the pressure surrounding his case reached a point where silence was no longer possible. Decisions had to be made, and the world around him began to shift in ways he could not yet fully understand. But even as change approached, Abdullah Rahman remained grounded in one simple truth. Survival had brought him this far, and whatever came next, whether freedom or further struggle, he would face it with the same quiet resilience that had carried him through decades of chains. And though he did not know it yet, the next chapter of his life would take him closer to freedom than he had ever been since the day he was captured. But freedom itself would bring challenges he had never imagined. Because a man who survives slavery does not simply return to the world he once knew, he must learn how to exist in a world that has already changed without him. Return to a changed homeland begins with a silence that felt heavier than any chain Abdullah Rahman Ibrahim ibn Sori had ever worn, because silence on the ocean carried memory, and memory carried pain, and pain carried time that could never be recovered. As the ship moved steadily across the Atlantic, the waves beneath it no longer felt like the same sea that had once swallowed his freedom decades earlier. Yet to Abdul Rahman, it felt like the same endless witness to human suffering. The same water that had carried him away in chains was now carrying him back as a free man. In name, but not yet fully free in spirit, he stood at the edge of the deck many times watching the horizon, as if it might answer questions that had lived inside him for 40 years. Questions about home, about family, about whether the world he once knew still existed, or had already turned into memory without him. Isabella stood sometimes beside him in quiet understanding, not forcing words because they both knew that some emotions could not be spoken without breaking something inside. The journey back to Africa was not filled with the terror of his first voyage, but it was filled with a strange emptiness, because survival had taught him how to endure suffering, but not how to return from it. At night he often dreamed of Futa Jalan, the mountains, the voices, the sound of drums that once marked time and celebration. But when he woke, he saw only ocean and sky stretching endlessly in every direction. As days passed, his mind shifted constantly between hope and fear. Hope that someone would remember him, fear that no one would. Hope that his father might still be alive in memory, if not in body. Fear that everything he once belonged to had dissolved into history. Without waiting for his return, when land finally appeared on the horizon, it did not arrive like a miracle, but like a question that had waited too long to be answered. The coastline of Africa rose slowly under morning light, and for a moment Abdullah Rahman could not move because his body did not believe what his eyes were seeing. After 40 years of absence, the land of his birth was finally real again in front of him. The ship approached steadily, and people on shore began to gather, some curious, some cautious, some already hearing rumors of a man returning from America who had once been enslaved but was said to be of royal lineage. When the ship finally anchored, the sound of waves against wood felt like the closing of a long chapter of suffering. Abdullah Rahman stepped onto the soil carefully, as if afraid it might disappear beneath him. His feet touched the ground, and he stopped completely, breathing deeply. Then he knelt slowly and placed his hands on the earth, the same earth he had not touched since the day of his capture. And in that moment, tears came without permission, not loud or dramatic, but heavy and silent, carrying decades of loss. Behind him, people watched but did not interrupt, because something about his presence carried dignity that silence itself respected. News of his return spread quickly through nearby communities and villages, and soon people began arriving to see him. Some older individuals recognized stories they had heard long ago about a prince taken by slave traders. Others only knew fragments passed down through generations, and many simply came out of curiosity because such a return felt almost impossible. Abdullah Rahman began asking immediately about his family, about his father, about his childhood companions, about anyone who might still remember him. But answers came slowly and painfully, because time had done what time always does. It had changed everything without asking permission. He learned that many who once knew him had passed away, including his father, whose memory still lived strongly in his heart, but whose presence no longer existed in the world. That knowledge struck him deeply because he had survived slavery believing that return might mean reunion, but instead return meant absence in a different form, absence of those he loved, absence of the world he remembered, an absence of the certainty that home would feel like home again. Yet not everything was lost, because among the elders there were those who remembered the royal family, who remembered the boy who vanished, and when they saw Abdul Rahman, they confirmed slowly through emotion and recognition that he was indeed the same child who had been taken so many years ago. That moment carried a mixture of joy and grief because recognition did not erase loss. It only confirmed how much had been lost. Villagers gathered to hear his story, and when he spoke of Mississippi, of plantations, of forced labor, of separation, and of survival across decades, many listened in disbelief because the world he described felt distant from their understanding, yet his words carried weight because they were not told as legend but as lived memory. He described the ships, the chains, the markets where human beings were sold, and the endless fields where labor replaced time itself, and as he spoke, the emotional impact spread through those listening like fire through dry grass. Some wept openly, others remained silent in shock, and some struggled to comprehend how such suffering could exist in distant lands across the ocean. Yet even as he shared his past, Abdul Rahman felt another layer of pain growing inside him. Because speaking about America also meant confronting the reality that part of his life remained there, his children, his grandchildren, his family formed under conditions of slavery, all still connected to a place he had left behind. And that connection pulled at him constantly, making return to Africa incomplete in emotional terms. As days passed, he tried to reconnect with his homeland, walking through familiar landscapes that now felt both familiar and foreign. The mountains still stood, the rivers still flowed, but everything around them had changed. Generations had moved forward, customs had evolved, and the boy who once ran freely through these lands now walked through them as an old man carrying memory like weight on his shoulders. Sometimes he would stop in silence just to listen to the wind because it felt like the only voice that still remembered him without judgment. People treated him with respect, but also curiosity, because his life had become something between history and living testimony, a reminder of both greatness and loss. Yet internally he struggled with belonging, because Africa felt like home, but also like a place that no longer fully recognized who he had become after decades in another world. At times he spoke with elders about the past, and they shared stories of how the region had changed, of conflicts, of shifting leadership, of communities adapting to new realities. And through these conversations he understood that time does not pause for anyone, not even for princes. The emotional weight of this realization sometimes overwhelmed him, because while he had survived physically, emotionally he was still adjusting to a world that had moved forward without him. Isabella supported him through this transition, standing beside him as he processed memories and grief, and together they shared quiet moments under African skies that felt both healing and painful at the same time. As the reality of his return settled deeper into daily life, Abdul Rahman began to reflect more on identity itself, wondering what it truly meant to belong to a place, whether identity was tied to land, to memory, or to the people who remember you, he realized that he now existed between two worlds: Africa, that shaped his birth and early life, and America that shaped his survival and endurance, neither fully complete without the other. And this dual existence created a silence inside him that words could not fully express. Meanwhile, discussions continued among local leaders and visitors about his story. Because his return carried symbolic meaning beyond personal history, it represented the global impact of the slave trade and the hidden lives that had been scattered across continents. Some viewed him as a symbol of resilience, others as a reminder of injustice, and others still as a curiosity. But for Abdul Rahman himself, he remained simply a man trying to understand what remained of his life after survival. In private moments, he often thought about the ocean journey that had brought him back, and how the same waters had once taken him away in chains. That contrast stayed with him constantly, reminding him that life does not move in straight lines, but in cycles of loss and return. Yet even return does not restore what was lost. It only reshapes it. As weeks turned into months, he began to feel physical weakness more strongly. The years of labor and hardship had left lasting damage on his body, and though he tried to remain active and engaged, he could feel time pressing against him in ways that could not be ignored. Still, he continued sharing his story with younger generations, because he believed memory was responsibility, and forgetting would allow history to repeat itself. Children gathered around him often to listen to tales of distant lands, and while they enjoyed the stories of courage and endurance, they also learned about suffering and injustice in ways that shaped their understanding of the world. Abdul Rahman saw meaning in this exchange, even as he carried his own unresolved grief. And though he had finally returned to his homeland, he understood that the journey of his life was not simply about arrival, but about reconciling everything that had been taken, everything that had been changed, and everything that could never return. And in this realization, he stood quietly beneath the African sky one evening, looking at the horizon as the sun set, knowing that he had survived what many did not, but also knowing that survival itself does not erase what was lost. It only ensures that the story continues to be told. The last days of the Forgotten Prince begins in a quiet place where time seemed to slow down around Abdullah Rahman Ibrahim Ibn Sori, as if the world itself understood that his journey was approaching its final horizon. After years of survival, return, and emotional struggle, his body had begun to carry the full weight of everything he had endured, and even though his spirit remained strong in memory and wisdom, his physical strength was slowly fading like a candle resisting the wind. The village in Africa where he now lived had become familiar again, yet it never fully felt like the same home he had left as a young prince, because home had changed, and so had he. Every morning he would wake up early and sit quietly outside, watching the land breathe under soft light, listening to distant sounds of daily life, children running, women speaking, men preparing for work, and nature continuing as it always had. But inside him there was a deep stillness that carried both peace and sorrow together. Isabella stayed close to him during these days, watching over him with care and patience, understanding that words were no longer always necessary between them, because their lives had already spoken enough suffering and survival for a lifetime. Abdullah Rahman often reflected on the long path that had brought him here, the sudden attack in his homeland decades ago, the capture, the chains, the brutal march through unfamiliar lands, the endless ocean voyage where hope nearly disappeared, the plantation fields of Mississippi where his identity was buried under labor, and the slow and uncertain return that brought him back to Africa but could never return him to the exact world he once knew. These memories no longer felt like distant events. They felt like layers inside him that had become part of who he was. One afternoon, a group of young visitors came to see him. Students who had heard stories of the man who had survived slavery and returned as a prince from memory. They sat around him quietly, respecting his fragile condition, and asked him questions about his life, about how he survived so many years of pain, and about what kept him from giving up. Abdul Rahman looked at them slowly, his eyes carrying both exhaustion and calmness, and he told them that survival was never about strength alone, but about remembering identity even when the world tries to erase it. He explained that slavery was not only chains on the body, but also pressure on the mind and soul, and that the greatest struggle was to remain human when everything around you tries to make you forget you are human. The students listened with deep attention, because his words were not like teachings from books, but like lived truth carved from suffering. After they left, silence returned to the space around him, and he sat for a long time thinking about how strange life had been, how a boy born into royalty had ended up surviving 40 years in slavery and still returned to tell the story. Yet even in this reflection, there was no bitterness in him anymore, only acceptance shaped by time. As days passed, his health continued to decline slowly, his body becoming weaker and his movements more, but his mind remained active, filled with memories that never faded. Sometimes he would speak softly to Isabella about Africa, about Mississippi, about the ocean, and about the strange way life had separated and reunited him with worlds that should never have been divided in the first place. Isabella would listen, and sometimes hold his hand without speaking, because she understood that some emotions existed beyond language. One evening, as the sun began to set in deep orange tones across the sky, Abdul Rahman asked to sit outside for a while. He wanted to feel the wind on his face and see the sky clearly. As if trying to memorize the world one last time in detail, villagers nearby noticed his quiet presence and gave him space, respecting the dignity that had followed him. Even through suffering, he looked toward the horizon and thought about the ocean again, the same ocean that had carried him away as a captive and later carried him back as a free man. And he realized that water does not remember human suffering, but humans do, and that memory becomes both burden and legacy. In his final days, he spoke often about the importance of remembering history, not as stories of glory alone, but as truth that includes pain. He wanted younger generations to understand what had happened so that it would never be repeated. He spoke about identity, about dignity, and about the importance of knowing who you are. Even when circumstances try to strip it away, people who visited him during this time often left in silence because his presence carried something that words could not easily explain, a mixture of sorrow, wisdom, and peace that only comes from surviving the unimaginable. Isabella remained by his side constantly, and their bond in these final days became even more profound, built not on survival alone, but on shared understanding of everything they had endured together. One night he told her softly that she had given him strength when he had nothing left, and she replied that they had carried each other through darkness. As his condition worsened, he spent more time resting, but even in rest, his mind continued traveling through memory, sometimes returning to childhood in Africa, sometimes to the brutal fields of Mississippi, sometimes to the ocean, crossing that separated those worlds. It was as if his life had become a long circle that finally reached its beginning again, yet not fully the same. During one of his final conversations with elders in the village, he spoke about forgiveness, not as forgetting injustice, but as freeing oneself from the endless weight of hatred. He said that hate can keep a person chained even after physical freedom is achieved, and that survival means learning how to carry pain without letting it destroy the soul. These words stayed with those who heard them because they came from a man who had lived through everything he described. As his strength continued to fade, The village became quieter around him, as if nature itself was preparing for transition. And on the final night of his life, he lay peacefully surrounded by those who cared for him. The sky above was filled with stars that seemed closer than ever. He was no longer afraid, because fear had long left him after years of suffering and endurance. Instead, there was acceptance, a quiet understanding that his journey had reached completion. He thought briefly of his father, of his childhood, of the ocean, and of the countless lives he had shared suffering with. And then he simply breathed with calmness that came from resolution rather than struggle. As dawn approached, Abdul Rahman Ibrahim Ibn Sori passed away quietly, leaving behind no wealth or kingdom in physical form, but leaving something far greater, a story that carried the weight of history and humanity combined. News of his passing spread through the region, and people came to mourn, not only a man but a symbol of endurance against unimaginable suffering. They remembered him as someone who had lived through the deepest darkness and still returned with dignity intact. And even though his body was gone, his memory remained deeply rooted in the hearts of those who knew his story, because he represented not only one life but many lives that were never recorded. And as time continued moving forward, his story remained as a reminder that survival itself can become testimony, and that even when a prince is reduced to chains, the truth of who he is can never be fully destroyed. And in that truth, his final days found their meaning, not in suffering, but in the legacy of resilience that would continue long after his voice had fallen silent. The legacy that refused to die begins after silence had settled over the life of Abdul Rahman Ibrahim Ibn Sori. But silence in history is never truly empty, because stories that carry deep truth continue to echo long after the body is gone. In the years following his passing, the memory of the African prince who survived slavery did not disappear. Instead, it slowly traveled through generations, sometimes fading, sometimes returning stronger when people were ready to understand it. At first, his story lived only in fragments, old records, scattered testimonies, and whispered accounts passed down by those who had once met him or heard him speak. But as time moved forward, scholars and historians began to reconnect these fragments and realized they were looking at something far more significant than a simple biography. They were uncovering the life of a man who had crossed worlds under the most extreme conditions of human suffering and endurance. Abdul Rahman Ibrahim Ibn Sori was no longer just a memory of one plantation or one region. He became a symbol of a global history that connected Africa, America, and the Atlantic world in ways that could not be ignored. Researchers studying his life discovered the depth of his education, his command of language, and the complexity of his royal background. And these discoveries challenged long-held assumptions about enslaved Africans, because his existence proved that many who were taken were not isolated individuals without history, but people with education, leadership, culture, and identity that slavery tried to erase. As his story spread further, it reached classrooms, books, and public discussions where people began to confront uncomfortable truths about the past, in America particularly. His life became part of conversations about the human cost of slavery and the hidden histories of those who were forced into it. People were moved not only by his suffering, but by his dignity, because even after decades of violence and separation, he never lost the core of who he was. He remained thoughtful, composed, and deeply human. And that resilience made his story unforgettable. In Africa, his memory also grew stronger over time, especially among communities that saw his life as part of a larger historical wound caused by the slave trade. Elders told stories of the prince who had been taken and returned, and younger generations listened with a mixture of disbelief and emotion. realizing that history was not just something written in books, but something that had lived inside real people with families and dreams. In both continents, his name became a bridge between past and present, between loss and understanding, and between silence and recognition as more research was done. Historians began to piece together how rare documented cases like his truly were, and they realized that his life offered a unique window into the psychological, cultural, and human impact of slavery, not as an abstract system, but as a lived experience that reshaped identity across decades. His writings, especially those in Arabic, became important evidence of African literacy and scholarship that existed long before colonial narratives attempted to diminish it, and this forced many to reconsider how history had been taught and understood. But beyond academic study, his story also reached ordinary people who saw in him something deeply personal, because his experience of loss, endurance, and identity spoke to universal human struggles. People who had experienced displacement, trauma, or separation found meaning in his survival, and through that connection, his legacy continued to grow. Yet perhaps the most powerful part of his story was not simply that he survived, but that he retained humanity in a system designed to erase it, even when he was treated as property, even when he was separated from family, even when the world around him refused to recognize his past. He continued to act with dignity, patience, and quiet strength, and that became the core of his legacy over time. Monuments of memory were not built in stone alone, but in stories, in lessons taught to children, in writings preserved by historians, and in discussions that questioned injustice wherever it appeared. His life became a reminder that history is not only about those who held power, but also about those who endured its consequences. And that truth, even when buried, has a way of resurfacing. In modern times, his story continues to be retold in documentaries, books, and educational discussions, not as entertainment, but as a reflection of human resilience and the cost of oppression. People studying his life often pause at the contrast between who he was born to be and what he was forced to endure. And in that contrast, they see a deeper truth about humanity itself, that identity cannot be fully destroyed even under extreme conditions. It can be hidden, suppressed, or wounded, but not erased. And that realization continues to shape how people think about history and justice. In Africa, his story is also used to remind younger generations of the importance of remembering their heritage, because his life shows how quickly identity can be disrupted by violence and displacement, and how important it is to preserve memory even when time tries to erase it. Through all these reflections, his legacy has become larger than his individual life. He is remembered not only as a prince or a survivor, but as a witness to an era that reshaped millions of lives across continents. And perhaps the most enduring message from his journey is that human dignity can survive even when everything else is taken away, and the truth, once revealed, cannot be permanently silenced as time continues to move forward. His story remains alive, not because it is frozen in the past, but because it continues to speak to the present, reminding the world of what was lost, what was endured, and what must never be forgotten. And in that enduring echo, the forgotten prince remains unforgotten, his voice carried forward not by chains or silence, but by memory, understanding, and the unending human need to tell the truth about its own history. The voice that still speaks across time brings us to the end of the journey of Abdul Rahman Ibrahim Ibn Sori, but not the end of what his life means to the world, because some stories do not end when a person dies. They continue living inside memory, inside history, and inside every heart that chooses to understand them. His life began in royalty, was broken by slavery, reshaped by survival, and restored through memory. Yet even restoration could not fully heal everything that was taken from him. What remains is something greater than pain or loss. What remains is truth, and truth has a way of refusing silence. Through his journey, we see a man who was taken from his homeland, forced into chains, carried across the ocean, and made to live in a world that tried to erase his identity. Yet even in the darkest moments, he never completely lost who he was. He carried dignity when dignity was denied. He carried memory when memory was threatened. And he carried humanity when the world tried to reduce him to something less. His story reminds us that slavery was not only about labor or control, it was about families separated, cultures displaced, identities challenged, and generations affected in ways that still echo today. Yet within that painful truth there is also a message of strength, because Abdullah Rahman survived what many did not, and he returned to his homeland, carrying not just pain but wisdom. His life teaches us that identity is not easily destroyed, and that even when a person is taken far from home, the memory of who they are can remain alive, waiting for the moment it is finally recognized again. Today his story continues to be shared so that the world does not forget what happened, and so that future generations understand both the cruelty of the past and the resilience of those who lived through it. As we close this story, remember that Voices from Forgotten Soul exists to bring hidden histories back to life, to speak for those who were silenced, and to remind us that every life has meaning, even when the world tries to forget it. So if this story touched you, please follow, like, share, and repost this video. Turn on notifications on this channel so you never miss more powerful stories like this. Tell us in the comments what you learned from Abdullah Rahman's journey, and share where you are watching from, your city and your country. Your support helps keep these forgotten voices alive and helps us continue bringing you more emotional, powerful, and unforgettable stories like this.